Teacher, 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 miss, mister, teacher, mister. Do you find that your students call your name out loud hundreds of times every day? This can be exhausting, but I want to share with you some strategies I've seen some teachers use to help prevent this from happening. The other day, I was working with two different large groups of teachers, and I was working with them on some math content knowledge. And in that conversation, I put up a large number. The number was 9,800,000. And I asked the teachers to take a minute and think about, can we make sense of this number? Can we put this number into some perspective? And I said, take that 9,800,000, and I want you to think of a real life scenario that might actually represent. And I gave them a minute to process that, and the teachers were talking in groups and talking to each other and laughing and giggling. And for both groups, the first answer that was shared out when I said, who wants to share out what you have? What could 9,800,000 equal? And both of them said, I think it's the number of times I hear my name called out every single day. Now, the whole rest of the room, all the other teachers in the room laughed and giggled and said, oh yeah, that does feel like that sometimes. And I suspect that 9,800,000 is probably more times than your name is called per day. However, the point was really made was that the teachers hear their names a lot, and it's exhausting to hear their names over and over again. And again, both rooms, both groups of teachers, that was the first answer. So that tells me that is forefront in many teachers' minds, and it's a challenge many of us have, is that our names are called over and over and over again, and how do we prevent that from happening as much? And some teachers just say that it's annoying to hear their name over and over again. Teacher, 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 miss, miss, miss. But beyond annoying, it's actually going to be a detriment to learning. It's going to be exhausting to the teacher to have to continually respond to multiple questions throughout the day. It's even going to be exhausting for students to have to continually ask for your help to get what they need to feel heard. So we have to find a way to make it so that the students are heard, but you're not exhausted by the end of the day. So the students have a chance to think through what they need to get the help they need, but you also have a chance to breathe and think about next steps, as opposed to just playing whack-a-mole, knocking questions down. So here's a few things that I've seen work in many classrooms, and I've seen them repeated in other classrooms, and they've worked for those teachers too. The first thing that's often used in elementary schools, but it can totally be used at every grade level, is developing a system of hand signals. And those hand signals could be for things that are common things that happen in the classroom. Can I stand up and get a drink of water? Can I go get a new pencil? Can I use the restroom? These are things that come up quite often. And if we develop a hand signal, instead of a student raising their hand to call out a teacher's name or to interrupt a teacher, we can quickly just put up a hand signal. Teacher can quickly look over, give a quick nod, yes or no, and we move on. And there was no discussion that happened, and it was a microsecond that was used for that conversation. And if we do use a hand signal like that, the student can quickly explain to the teacher what they need, kind of convey that information, and the teacher can quickly move on and say yes or no. We can do that without distracting the rest of the class. Now, I always love learning, and I always love learning from others there. So is there a hand signal that you use, or is there an activity in your classroom that you've created a hand signal for that we can share with others? I would love to hear that. Throw that in the comments. Now, this second idea about helping teachers to limit the number of times they hear their name called out in class sounds super easy, but it does require some commitment to having consistent expectations and routines in the classroom. One of the things we find is, especially early on in the year, if we have students calling out names, calling out teacher names, saying Mr., 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 Miss, 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 and the teacher responds, what that student is learning is that they can call out and they'll get a response from the teacher. Instead, I found many teachers redirect the students to say, remember, if you need my attention, I need you to raise your hand. Or even more specifically, if you need my attention, I need you to sit down in your seat and raise your hand, and then I'll call on you when I'm ready to do that. The second that I stopped doing that, the second that I let students call out my name, Mr., 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 teacher, 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 the second I respond to that, they're going to begin to learn that they can just call my name out to get my attention, and I will respond to them. If I can get students to raise their hands, to sit in their seats and raise their hands, and to follow those routines, everyone knows the expectation, and everyone knows that there's a way to get the attention, an appropriate way, but I do need to have that consistency. The third thing I learned from a kindergarten teacher a number of years back, and I just thought it was awesome, and I've seen many teachers do it since then, and I've also helped teachers to kind of practice this a lot since then too. But this third idea that we have to help teachers limit the number of times students interrupt them especially works in small groups. If you're a teacher running a small group and you're working with 3 or 5 or 8 students, however many students at your kidney table or your horseshoe table, and you have other students around the room, it can be tempting for those students to come over and ask for help. It can be tempting for you to want to give the help. But what we find is the more you do that, the less actual teaching you get to do with that group in front of you. So in order to help everyone understand that when there's a group of students in front of the teacher, we don't want to interrupt that teacher. Many teachers I've seen wear a funny little hat or a funny little kind of gimmicky type thing. I've seen teachers wear a Mickey Mouse hat or a big red fedora, or even there was a teacher that wore big red orange glasses. So if you have students that tend to interrupt you during your teacher time at your teacher desk, consider wearing something a little bit flashy and telling students, hey, when this is on, these students at my table are the most important students in the classroom. Remember, you'll get your chance when you're here with me at the teacher table, but when my red fedora is on or when my orange glasses are on, remember that's a time that only people at this table can be talking to me, asking for help or asking for directions. If you're not with me at the teacher table and I have my red hat on, then that's going to be a time when you have to hold that question for later, or you have to find another way to answer your question without me. It is always funny when I walk into a room after I've worked with a teacher and I see one of those silly hats or a silly wig or a silly kind of jacket on there. But what I do see is that there aren't students coming up and interrupting that instruction, and it's a wonderful thing. The fourth thing we can do to help limit the number of times students come to you with questions or come to you with interruptions or call your name out is bringing more turn and talks into the classroom. A lot of times when students come up to you to ask for help or to check in, it's really because they just want to express their voice. They may not even know that, but they want to find a way to express their feelings, to express their voice in the classroom. So if I create a time for a turn and talk or a think, pair, share, that creates an opportunity for students to express themselves, to share their thinking, and for them to talk to someone else and get that out of their system. So if you find that happens a lot and you're interrupted a lot in your class, consider offering more times for students to talk to each other, because that helps them to kind of get that social skills, to get that social need out of their system. And the final activity that I would recommend if we're having students continually call out your name, teacher, 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 Mr., 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 the final activity, again, sounds simple enough, but honestly, just once a week during morning meeting time or once a week during time we have, just having a little check-in, a little reminder to the students of why do we have these rules? Why do we raise our hands? Why is it inappropriate to always interrupt the teacher or to interrupt the flow of the class with questions? And thinking about, okay, what are the things we need to do that for? Why do we have those procedures? Why do we have those routines? Thinking about things like, we need to make sure everyone has a voice. We need to make sure that we can move forward. I want to make sure I have time to answer your questions. I might even tell the students, honestly, it's exhausting to be able to answer all your questions over and over again. Here's a different way we can organize some of those questions. Here's a different way that we can help you to find your answers. And having some of the conversations with the class, with the students, saying, if you have a question and I'm busy, what are some things you can do instead? Who are some other students? What are some other resources around the room you can use to answer your own question so you don't have to come to me? This can actually be empowering to students to show them that they can begin to answer their own questions too. So those are some different strategies that I've seen work in multiple classrooms. None of those strategies were born from me. They were all stolen from other teachers and pushed on to other teachers, and I've seen them work time and time again. I would love to hear if folks have other ideas about thinking about how do I get students to call my name out less so that I can spend more time teaching? How can I be less exhausted at the end of the day by being less inundated by questions and less inundated by my name being repeated and over again? Hopefully these ideas work. If you have other ideas that do work, please feel free to throw them in the comments. I definitely learned from everyone else that I talked to. Have a great day.